Hello and welcome to Breaking Embargo. I'm Peter Barnes. That's Samara Gill. Let's get into it. Samara, thank you so much for joining us here at Breaking Embargo. It's an absolute pleasure. For those who don't know, Samara is the star of What Just Happened with Kevin O'Sullivan, and she is a producer over at Talk TV. She's the one that tries to keep me and Kevin in line on a Friday. So good luck. How are you doing? You okay?
No, the pleasure is all mine to come on this show. I think this new project's really, really interesting, and I just can't wait to see what you do with it, Pete. So, thank you for having me.
Look, low expectations.
As a producer, my expectations are always on the ground, don't you worry.
Hey, you're just happy we turn up at the end of the day.
That's true.
Yeah, so what I really wanted to dive in with you, Samara, was what it's like to really put the news together. You know, people like myself, we appear on it, we talk about it, we're involved in it in lots of different ways, but the responsibility to put a show like What Just Happened, or even, Kevin's The Political Asylum, that's a lot of moving parts. It's a lot of people. And, the responsibility to pick the stories, what works, what doesn't work. How do you approach that on a day-to-day basis?
I mean, that's a really, really good question. I love this topic when you came to me with it, because I think it's not discussed enough. What stories we pick, what drives people. Do we rely on what we want to push, or do we let the people push us? I mean, these are all really relevant questions, especially in today's media, where most of it is driven by online, social. X is a very big factor. But it's interesting to see how shows that are not taking on the social media angle are just getting left to the wayside. I mean, we've seen with ITV even yesterday, a lot of different cuts. The BBC is having record numbers of, their numbers are falling at record levels. And we're also seeing Sky as well, in very murky water. And I think as a producer, that's because they're not actually listening to what the people want. I think in terms of conservative media, we've shifted away from kind of talking about lower taxes and conservative policies. And it's turned very much more culture warsy. We talk about gender debates. People are interested in royal drama. There's free speech issues. Environmentalism has gone too far. And then, of course, immigration, which is a massive issue for our audience. So when I'm putting a show together, I'll always be looking at X. I'll be looking at what's trending, what's popular, and that will actually inform a lot of how we drive our show. And then there's also the host to think about. Kevin loves to control. I mean, Kevin O'Sullivan is who I work with predominantly, but I've worked with quite a number of different hosts, people like Alex Phillips. Alex really will do her own thing, and she'll just really want it. She'll be happy with whatever you give to her, and she'll put her own spin on it. Whereas someone like Kevin, he's very, very much wants to be in control of what stories he does, which is totally fair because he's an absolute veteran of the industry. And in terms of his, what you would say, editorial sense or knack, he has probably one of the best that I've ever worked with. He knows exactly what audiences will like and what's going to really, upset them or get them riled up, but in a good way, how they're actually feeling. So yeah, it's really a day-to-day thing, actually.
Yeah, I find that interesting with Kevin because he always says that, you've either got the journalistic instinct or you don't. He says it's something you could learn if you wanted to, but he says you're born with it or you're not. I was just, it has always fascinated me that what journalists focus on, and particularly the aspect of a story as well. Because something like immigration is a huge topic. So
yes.
How people narrow that down is always interested me because, if two people could look at one story in very different ways, is it sometimes a little bit of a challenge to get the balance right or to make sure you're covering all sides of a story?
That's a great question. I think that in terms of balance, that kind of goes out the door when you position yourself as an opinion channel. Of course, the BBC, Sky's going to have to provide some balance, but people are really ticked off by the immigration situation and they just want their voice to be heard. They don't need, someone coming in and saying, oh, but we really should be giving immigrants their voice and their rights. I mean, What's done really well for us is zoning in on those individual stories, those cases where ECHR judges or judges are really influenced by the ECHR, and they really can see where the injustice is being had. I mean, a lot of these judges have absolutely no touch with the real world. They haven't seen the immigration crisis on their doorstep like most British people have. And they're making these judgments really based on pure emotion, or that's what it seems to us. And when people see, children's chicken nugget preferences being put before the safety of British people because of these strange laws that have been putting in place, it does really put into focus what's actually going on with this crisis. So, from a news perspective, you can say, 1,000 people crossed the channel today. But when you'll zone in on one that might have had extremist tendencies, and we might have found their social media and see that they're very much pro an extremist group, then that really gets to how people are feeling. It's those individual stories that are really important to focus on from a producer's perspective, and what we've seen resonates with the audience the most.
Yeah, I was going to say, it always seems to me that anything with a kind of human element to it that you can relate to in some way, or you can at least like conceptualize in your own life. I think those seem to, coming from a messaging point of view for the political world, it's exactly the same thing. You've got to be able to put something out that people are not just going to watch, but also feel at the same time. And you've got to get that connection. And I think that's one thing that I know whenever we've done shows together, that the stories are always got that element of, I can see that happening here. Or maybe this has happened, or a little bit of it has happened to somebody else's life. You can see the weaving of that throughout. But, obviously the rise of kind of talk radio, or should I say the re-rise of people phoning in to radio stations.
That's a great way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of, it's something I've never really got, because as a politico, as a nerd, I presume there's like me and one other person that cares about literally any of this stuff. But it really does get me the variety of people that tune in to things like talk, and just the kind of the audience size and demographics and all the rest of it. That must be a challenge as well, because what interests one group does not interest another. To try and get that balance to keep the audience together. How do you approach stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's strangely quite homogenous, I think. I think it is a collective upset and a collective disenfranchised kind of perspective that a lot of our viewers have, and rightly so, because they don't recognize Britain anymore. And it's actually a growing group. We had, sort of a 46% rise in connected listeners, people coming from online, because I think they're seeing a lot of our content on YouTube and X. And that's kind of what we focused on, and definitely specifically my show that I produce. And people just want someone who sort of can listen to their perspective, but also preach to them what they want to hear. And we do that genuinely from the heart. I mean, there's no sort of, I feel this way behind the scenes, and then I'm going to say something else in front of the camera. There's none of that. But I think you're right about segmented audiences. I think as a producer, we had different things that we were looking at. I mean, the Farage versus Rupert Lowe situation, that was really tricky because that really divided our audience, and people felt a certain way. I mean, a lot of our audience, it's no secret, are reform voters, and there's a growing wave of that. And that's reflected in then them tuning into our audience. Of course, we have lots of different people, though. We have conservatives, we have old Labour voters that will watch. I've heard from all different people, Lib Dems, but the Farage Lowe stuff really divided people. I remember seeing a poll, and it was really a 50-50 split with how people went. And it did fraction off the audience a little bit. And from a producer perspective, you always want to make sure that you're sharing both sides. But I think some presenters did choose one side of that argument, and the audience responded in a way that suited them. So our audience is sensitive. The issue with today's media is that people will just switch off if they don't like what you're saying, and they're very happy to go to whatever YouTube video will resonate with them, or whatever Twitter post, or whatever host. So you do need to be careful in a way, but you also don't want to always just pander to whatever you think they'll say, if that makes sense. You do want to, of course, hold your ground. And I think you do a great job of that, Pete. You actually always make sure that there's a different perspective on the table, because as I said, it's not always, people don't just hold the exact same set amount of views. And you can't always pander to that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, actually, about kind of the tendency. I think people think that networks pander to their audience. I was like, they really don't, you know. I've sat on panels with people that I know for a fact that the Twitter is going to go mental and X is going to go insane because that person's appeared as a guest. I always find that fascinating, just to the kind of visceral reactions some people have just to the sheer presence of a person. You know, I sometimes I take it as a kind of feather in the cap, say just my presence has annoyed this person already, but I'm going to say, obviously, you're coming from Australia, and you talk about the people not recognizing Britain. What's the cultural differences here? You know, you must get asked this all the time. Sorry, but like, you know, you're putting together news stories that hark back to a country that you may not have even been in at the time. That must be a real challenge. I'm not going to lie, because there's some bits of it I can't even remember, and I've been lived here.
That's a nice way of putting, yes, I am an immigrant myself.
Yes, yeah, I couldn't think of a way to phrase it that wasn't that.
It's true. I don't. The hypocrisy does not pass me when I talk about all this stuff. I think it's interesting. My dad, he's Indian. He was an Indian immigrant in Australia. He came over in the 90s. And I think the key thing that I've recognized, both Australia and the UK, is that I'm a fan of immigration. I don't have a problem with immigration, but the UK, Australia, the US, these are golden ticket countries. We should not just be allowing whoever in. We should actually be expecting a really high level of immigration. There's a big difference between a Pakistani brain surgeon and then someone who can't speak English or doesn't want to assimilate to the culture and is very entrenched, maybe religiously in his beliefs, but wants to take everything that Britain has to offer in a good way. So there's a real difference. When I talk about immigration, I don't like to use blanket statements because I really do think that Britain should just respect itself more with who it allows in. I mean, me as an immigrant to Britain, I started off as a student. I paid triple the amount of money that that any Briton would have to pay to do uni over here. And I was happy to do that because I actually respect what Britain was offering. And then, you know, I've stayed here and I've worked in the media. So I think that there's a big difference when we're talking about immigration and who we want to let in. I think Australia has done a very good job at saying, no, if you're not going to contribute to Australia, if you're not going to assimilate into our community, then I'm sorry, but this isn't the right country for you. And I think Britain has almost been overcome with this sort of let's all hold hands and kumbaya and let everyone in. And that's now created resentment on the other side. It's not fair to either party. It's not fair to one segment of the population to say you can come in and you don't have to, you can keep all your culture and your culture's wonderful. Of course. But there is an element of respecting the country that you've moved to. I remember being in a cab with my dad. We just arrived in England on a holiday and we were talking to this cab driver who was Indian, my dad also Indian. And my mum tried to talk to the cab driver and he said, oh, sorry, I don't speak English. And my dad said, as an Indian to another Indian, but you've been here 20 years and you just told me that you've raised 5 kids here. Maybe you should be speaking the language, mate. Like, there's that element. So it's very nuanced and it's very layered. It's not just a blanket, all immigrants should be pushed out of the country. I mean, I don't think that's a right sentiment to have.
Yeah, I think you're right there. And I always use the immigration debate as a kind of, this is the worst of our politics. Because it is those lazy statements. It is people not really knowing what they're talking about. It is people getting confused between an economic migrant and a refugee and all the different aspects of that. You know, the nuance is just pulled out of that debate. And it is irritating sometimes to be a part of it. And listening to some people, I'm like, you don't really know what you're talking about, but there's no quite nice way of saying that without it sounding in their heads like you're calling them an idiot. Do you know what I mean? Like, in a way, it is one of those things where people need to really understand the terms before you engage in it. But I do find it interesting, though, looking at this back from a news perspective, because of that nuance. You know, you get X amount of minutes for a show and you've got to get everything in it. You know, sometimes do you feel like you're sometimes a bit too confined with some stories that, you could do one entire 3-hour thing on just one story. Do you know, how do you really kind of channel into the nuance to make sure you get it in more than anything else?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, people have always been saying, oh, everyone's attention spans are completely diminished. People can't concentrate for more than 2 minutes. But then we see Joe Rogan's podcast that goes for 3 hours and he doesn't edit anything. And just like you said, he'll talk about one topic. He won't, he'll talk about the healthcare system, or he'll talk about, Maha or MAGA. And so, that doesn't speak to me as that people's attention spans are diminishing. I do think that what we're doing over at Talk, I guess that's all I can speak to at the moment, is actually pretty good. We're giving topics, 20 to 30 minutes, which is not something you really see in other media. I mean, I know when I'm watching the BBC or Sky, I'll see a 5-minute segment on, sewerage or potholes that won't even get to the root cause of the issue. And I know they try to put, they try to compile stuff and they try to make sure that it's all, they can address all the different topics and all the different views. But I agree with you. I think people do want these deep dives, these investigations into topics. People actually really do want to understand what's going on.
Agreed.
And I think that traditional media isn't giving that to people at the moment. And you can see that with a mass exodus of viewers and listeners. And people are going to YouTube, and these 1 to 2 hour videos are getting a lot of engagement. And there's a reason for that. So I actually have all trust in the viewer and the listener these days, and not much in whoever's producing that stuff behind the scenes.
I think that's the key word: trust. I think so many people are convinced that the public are idiots and can't understand complexity and don't like complexity. I think the vast majority of the country realize that some issues are complicated and, are detail oriented, and, you've got to know what you're talking about. And I think the problem we're finding now as a society is because we've been treated like children. Now we have to kind of grow up to tackle some very big issues. There's no adults left in the room. And I think that's a real problem that we're seeing now, is like, we're trying to explain things that are really complex and will take a long time to do. And they say like, no, just do this. I was like, it doesn't work like that. This idea that you can snap your fingers and it suddenly be fixed is for the birds. But one of the other shows that you do, obviously, is What Just Happened. Now, that is an insane show, like insanity. It is what I imagine like a 4-year-old on a sugar high running around would be like around the studio. Do you like just like go?
You're referencing Kevin and not me.
I'm not saying anything. It's Andrew.
Yeah, put it all on Andrew.
Yeah, I was going to say one of the main things that you always focus on in there is obviously Harry and Meghan. I know Kevin's not obsessed with them, like in a bad way, because I do think you guys have a real point to make about these two, that we have to talk about them. The number of times when I ever get asked, if people on X are always like, oh, why do you just ignore them? Just ignore them. And for a time, I was very much of that opinion, but you can't. What they represent is important to talk about. And that's the one thing I was going to ask you was, when you get talking about things like Harry and Meghan, like these rather contentious issues, are you aware of what you say and the impact it might have on the audience itself? So do you kind of not self-censor, but you're hyper aware of what you're saying?
That's an interesting point. I mean, with Harry and Meghan, I've always felt how I felt about them. And it started on TikTok where I just sort of get my phone out and be like, come on. But I think you're completely right about how they actually represent something so much bigger. I think for at least a lot of conservative audiences specifically, they represent a breakdown of tradition. They represent the wokeosphere and California and the liberalization of everything when it didn't need to be like that. I think that people always wanted to lean on the royal family for strength, and what they've done is completely almost take that allure away and smash it up into little pieces, especially Harry and Meghan. So I think that they almost represent a time kind of like, I don't want to sort of put these two things together, but not the migrant crisis, but people want, that's how England was. That's how Britain was. And I think that, with Harry and Meghan, they represent everything wrong with all that, genuinely. I mean, they're all about branding, self-expression, making the biggest amount of money that they can out of people. It's not what the royal family was. It's not the people that gave us strength during World War II and helped us through so many different times, and also humanitarian crises. So I think that with Harry and Meghan, I don't self-censor at all. I will go to town on them. And
I've seen.
every single move that they make has been undoubtedly wrong and messed up. And as I said, in today's world where people are just struggling to sort of like pay their grocery bills, majority of people, their Montecito mansion lifestyle and Harry going on the BBC and whining about wanting the taxpayer to pay for his protection, it doesn't wash at all. And I'm actually proud of how the British public has stood their ground with them and said, no, we're not going to put up with this. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I always think the main driving factor as to why the public have kind of disowned them is they see it as a kind of disrespect to the late Queen.
Yes.
The country, I always separate the royal family and the Queen. I've always separated those two out. And I think the Queen was always held with such high regard, and Harry kind of walking away and the way that Meghan behaved. I think people in this country were like, you don't do that to grandma. Like, that's our grandma. You know what I mean?
It is. You've hit the nail on the head. You're completely right. It's also, I mean, in Philip's last days, they were giving interviews to Oprah, calling the royal family racist, and putting that man through hell. And then not long after, of course, Britain's grandmother passed away. And so people really can't forgive and forget, and they don't forgive and forget easily. And now look what he's doing. He's making his dad's life hell in his last couple of years. That man has been through it. I mean, people don't like to say that, you know, King Charles has been through adversity, but I do think he's actually had quite a tricky life personally. He's had the death of his ex-wife. He's had to hold so many different things on his back. And now Harry coming and publicly slating him like that is probably, I think Harry's going to have a lot of regrets about what he's been doing to his dad right now publicly. And I think that's going to come much later when Harry won't be able to reconcile.
Yeah, I think you're right there. And, you know, I think there are moments where you see it in his face and the way he speaks. He's like, I've messed up here. You're right. You could feel it in the interviews. And, you know, I always comment with Harry, it's that lack of accountability where he will not accept that he has played a role in a lot of this that has really driven a lot of people to not like him. But I do think you're right there with Prince Charles. I never really thought about it in that way, but you know, if everything that you just listed that he's been through, he did that with the media's attention on him. And that was at the time when, you know, the media wasn't as nice as it even is now.
Oh,
you know,
God,
they were, people forget that the royal family is a family, and, you know, they have their own personal problems, but they've got to do them, you know, in front of the world's press and then put on a happy face the entire time. It's not an easy thing to do by any stretch of the imagination.
We forget how welcoming he was. He walked Meghan Markle down the aisle when her dad refused to do that. He opened his arms to that family. He obviously, I mean, he paid for the wedding, but he really let that, you know, that African-American chaplain come in and talk. He really made it diverse. He welcomed that family with massively open arms, as I said, and then a slap in the face with the Book of Spare, airing all the dirty laundry of him raising the kids out. You know, really, really personal stories like Prince William pushing him down and them shouting at each other, stuff that no family would want aired to the public, let alone the royal family.
You don't air your dirty laundry.
No,
I think that is also one thing that annoyed a lot of people in this country. You don't do that. Like, you just don't. You know, what happens behind a front door is the family's business. It's nobody else's. You know, and
never
Harry,
complain,
the way that
never
he went
explain.
about it. Exactly. You know, I always said like the old phrase that the royal family was there to wallpaper over the cracks.
Yeah,
in other words,
it
is that kind of surface layer of presentability. Do you know? And I think we've lost that a little bit in this country, and I think it's responsible for a lot of the kind of decline in things that, you know, at least make it look nice. You know, it might not be working perfectly, but make it. And we've lost that kind of. We've got to put on a little bit of a show all the time. You know, and I think the prime example of it: people who go to the supermarket in pajamas. That right there.
The king wouldn't be doing that. I can tell you that much.
But for me, the moment that happened, that's when the UK fell. When we said it's perfectly fine to walk around in Ugg boots and pajamas around Tesco's. No, it's not. It's not.
I completely agree with that point. I mean, I think that's the national sign of giving up hope, along with Crocs, but that's a whole other conversation.
That's a whole other conversation.
But yeah, you're right. It is a sort of national decline. And I know it's trivial, Harry and Meghan, the royal family, but in history books, I do think it will be drawn upon, as you kind of just said, as part of this sort of dark moment in Britain's history. And I don't just say that in like, oh, dark moment in Britain's history. I do think that the crumbling of all these different institutions is something worth noting. And it does really affect the public's opinion of how they feel, how their country's going, and, you know, if they should be going down to Sainsbury's or Tesco in their pajamas.
Yeah. For me, it's the simple fact that we're going through the next industrial revolution. You know, everything is going to change. Everything. The way that we do, whether we watch entertainment, the way that we work, the way we travel, all of it. And I just don't think we're prepared in this country. I don't think we've been prepared by the government, but successive ones, to get ready for this change. No. And I also think socially, I think so much was kind of let go that now we're scrambling to bring it all back together. And that's looking like an overreaction to people, when actually it's like, no, we're trying to hold everybody in, because this is going to be a bit of a bumpy ride. And I think that's the driving factor for me of this kind of dark moment is we let things slip. Now we're scrambling as things are changing around us, and things are happening to us, and we're not the change. Do you know what I mean? Like we're not in the driving seat.
Yeah,
that's the way.
No, yeah. I couldn't agree more, actually. And I think that I've lived in Russia. I've lived in, obviously, Australia. I spent quite a lot of time in China as well during my childhood. And yeah, unfortunately, those countries have all been working behind the scenes, while we have been way too held up with our little gender wars and our culture wars about things. And, what gender is that? And what color should a fish identify at? You know, just ridiculous stuff. And they have been working away behind the scenes. And unfortunately, Britain might be usurped if we don't get a reset and a change pretty quickly, because, as I said, even just the way that these countries raise their children with much more resilience and also much more nationalism for their own country, it's inevitably going to affect us. So yeah, I agree. Britain might be left in the wayside, I think, if something doesn't change quickly. But it is heartening to see that there is a change and people do want something better for us. And that's always going to be, I think, Britain's strong point, is that they don't put up with being shortchanged for long. Yeah,
that's very true. And from a political aspect, like, I could feel it, that something is coming. You can just feel it when you talk to people, and when you're around certain incidents and things like that. You're like, this is different. It just feels different. And I think we're really in that moment now but it could go either way. Like, anything can happen. It's not like a preset thing. It's like, something is happening. I don't know what is happening, but it's happening.
I was going to ask you. I need to know more about that, more details.
If I could, I'd tell you, but I can't even work it out for myself yet. But anyway, Samara, thank you so much for sitting down with us. This has been absolutely fascinating and brilliant. And yeah, I will leave all of Samara's details in the description below. Please do go follow her. She's brilliant. I love her to pieces. And yeah, thanks again. And I'll catch you next time.